Marcus Thompson adjusted his worn-out sneakers as he walked through the heavy oak doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse. At 17, he looked even younger with his slight frame and nervous demeanor. His faded jeans and oversized hoodie made him stand out among the professionally dressed lawyers and court officials bustling through the marble corridors. The security guard at the metal detector gave him a suspicious look. "You lost, kid?" the guard asked, eyeing Marcus up and down. "No, sir. I'm here for the Henderson case," Marcus replied quietly, his voice barely audible above the echo of footsteps in the grand hallway. The guard chuckled and shook his head. "Sure you are, son. Courtroom 3B is down the hall, but I think you might want to check if there's a school field trip today instead." Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but said nothing. He had grown accustomed to people underestimating him. Living in the East Side projects with his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident 3 years ago, he had learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut. But today was different. Today, everything he had been working toward in secret would finally come to light. As he made his way down the polished hallway, Marcus couldn't help but think about how he had ended up here. It all started 2 years ago, when he discovered a box of old law books in the basement of the community center. The elderly janitor, Mr. Williams, had mentioned they belonged to a lawyer who used to volunteer there before he passed away. While other kids his age were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Marcus found himself drawn to those dusty volumes. At first, the legal language seemed impossible to understand. Words like jurisprudence and tort and habeas corpus might as well have been written in a foreign language. But Marcus was nothing if not determined. He spent hours in the public library, using their computers to research every term he didn't understand. He watched countless hours of court proceedings online, studying how lawyers presented their arguments and how judges responded. His grandmother, Rosa, initially worried about his obsession with law books. "Baby, you sure you don't want to go outside and play with kids your age?" she would ask, finding him hunched over case studies at their small kitchen table late into the night. But Rosa began to notice something remarkable happening. Marcus wasn't just reading these books. He was absorbing them. He would explain complex legal concepts to her in simple terms, helping her understand tenant rights when their landlord tried to raise the rent illegally. He helped neighbors fill out legal documents and understand court notices they received. The turning point came 6 months ago, when Marcus learned about the Henderson case. Sarah Henderson was a single mother from his neighborhood, who was being evicted from her apartment despite paying rent on time every month. Her landlord claimed she had violated her lease by having overnight guests, but Marcus suspected there was more to the story. The building was scheduled for demolition to make way for luxury condos, and the landlord needed all tenants out. Sarah couldn't afford a lawyer, and the Legal Aid Society had a 6-month waiting list. She was facing eviction in just 2 weeks. Marcus approached her hesitantly one evening as she sat on the front steps of their building, crying while holding an eviction notice. "Mrs. Henderson," he said softly, "I think I might be able to help you." Sarah looked up at the teenager with red, puffy eyes. "That's sweet of you, Marcus, but unless you know a good lawyer who works for free, I don't think anyone can help me now." Marcus took a deep breath. "Actually, I've been studying law on my own. I know it sounds crazy, but I think your landlord is violating several housing codes and tenant protection laws. Would you let me look at your lease and all the documents you've received?" Sarah was desperate enough to agree. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly, researching precedents and building what he believed was a solid case. He discovered that the landlord had indeed violated multiple housing regulations and had not followed proper legal procedures for eviction. More importantly, he found evidence that similar evictions in the building were part of a pattern designed to force out long-term tenants. But there was one major problem. Marcus wasn't a lawyer. He couldn't represent Sarah in court officially. However, he learned that in small claims and housing court, tenants were allowed to have advisors assist them, even if those advisors weren't licensed attorneys. Sarah could represent herself with Marcus coaching her from the gallery. The plan seemed solid until 3 days before the hearing, when Sarah fell down the stairs at work and broke her leg. She was hospitalized and couldn't attend the hearing. Under normal circumstances, this would mean an automatic default judgment against her. That's when Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He had discovered an obscure provision in state law that allowed for emergency representation in housing cases under very specific circumstances. If he could convince the judge that he was acting as Sarah's designated representative with her written consent, and if he could demonstrate sufficient knowledge of the law, he might be allowed to argue her case. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. Marcus spent the last 3 days before the hearing preparing more intensively than he ever had for anything in his life. He memorized every relevant statute, every applicable precedent, and every procedural rule. He practiced his arguments in front of his grandmother, who listened patiently even though she understood only half of what he was saying. "You sure about this, baby?" Rosa asked the night before the hearing. "This is a big responsibility, and those people in that courthouse, they're not going to take kindly to a young black boy from the projects trying to play lawyer." Marcus looked at his grandmother with determination in his eyes. "Grandma Rosa, Mrs. Henderson is going to lose her home if nobody helps her. I've spent 2 years learning this stuff, and I know I'm right about the law. I can't just sit back and let injustice happen when I have the knowledge to fight it." Now, standing outside courtroom 3B, Marcus felt the weight of that decision. Through the small window in the door, he could see the courtroom filling up with lawyers, court officials, and other people involved in the morning's docket. Judge Patricia Hawthorne was already at the bench reviewing files. She was known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for delays or frivolous arguments. Marcus checked his watch. 9:45 a.m. The Henderson case was scheduled for 10 p.m. He had 15 minutes to gather his courage and prepare for what would either be the most triumphant or most humiliating moment of his young life. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed open the courtroom door and stepped into what felt like another world entirely. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus walked down the center aisle toward the front benches. Every head turned to look at the teenager who clearly didn't belong in this formal setting. The clickety-clack of the court reporter's fingers stopped mid-sentence. Even the bailiff paused his routine paperwork to stare. Judge Patricia Hawthorne looked up from her files with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. At 58, she had seen everything in her 25 years on the bench, but a teenager in street clothes walking confidently toward the counsel table was definitely a first. She removed her reading glasses and leaned forward. "Excuse me, young man," Judge Hawthorne called out, her voice carrying the authority that had silenced countless courtrooms. "Are you lost? This is not a public gallery tour." Marcus stopped in his tracks, feeling dozens of pairs of eyes boring into him. His mouth went dry, but he managed to find his voice. "No, Your Honor. I'm here for the Henderson versus Westfield Properties case. I'm representing Mrs. Sarah Henderson." The courtroom erupted in quiet chuckles and whispers. Several lawyers exchanged amused glances and shook their heads. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, stepped forward as if ready to escort Marcus out of the building. Judge Hawthorne's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared under her gray hair. She looked down at her docket, then back at Marcus, then at her docket again. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "I said I'm here to represent Sarah Henderson in her eviction case against Westfield Properties, Your Honor," Marcus repeated, his voice growing stronger despite his racing heart. The judge set down her papers and leaned back in her chair. A smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just heard the most ridiculous thing imaginable. "Son," she said, drawing out the word like honey dripping from a spoon, "do you have any idea where you are right now? This is a court of law, not a high school debate club. Are you telling me that you believe you can practice law in my courtroom?" The laughter from the gallery became more audible now. Marcus heard someone behind him whisper, "Kid's probably here on a dare." Another voice added, "Probably saw too many episodes of Law and Order." Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he had come too far to back down now. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folder containing Sarah Henderson's written authorization and his research. "Your Honor, I have Mrs. Henderson's written consent to represent her interests. She's currently hospitalized due to an injury and cannot be present today. Under Section 47B of the State Housing Code, emergency representation is permitted in eviction proceedings when—" "Stop right there," Judge Hawthorne interrupted, holding up her hand. The amusement in her voice was now tinged with irritation. "I don't know what website you found that information on, or what television show gave you the idea that you could waltz into my courtroom and play lawyer, but I can assure you that's not how the legal system works." She turned to address the opposing counsel, Robert Westfield, Jr., who represented his family's property management company. Westfield was a sharp-dressed man in his 40s who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine advertisement for expensive suits. He was trying very hard not to laugh out loud. "Mr. Westfield," Judge Hawthorne said, "I apologize for this circus. Obviously, Mrs. Henderson has chosen not to appear today, which means we'll proceed with a default judgment in favor of your client." Marcus stepped forward, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Mrs. Henderson did not choose to be absent. She was injured at work and is currently in the hospital. I have documentation of her injury and her explicit written request for me to represent her interests today." Judge Hawthorne's patience was wearing thin. "Young man, I don't care if you have a signed letter from the President of the United States. You cannot practice law without a license, period, end of discussion." "But, Your Honor," Marcus persisted, "I'm not practicing law. I'm acting as Mrs. Henderson's designated representative under the emergency provisions of the Housing Code. The law specifically allows for non-attorney representation in housing court under these circumstances." The judge's expression darkened. "Son, I've been practicing law longer than you've been alive. I think I know what the law says and doesn't say, and right now what the law says is that you need to sit down, be quiet, and let the adults handle adult business." The courtroom erupted in laughter again. Someone in the back called out, "Should have stayed in school, kid." Another voice added, "Maybe try this again when you graduate high school." Marcus felt tears of frustration welling up in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He thought about Sarah Henderson lying in a hospital bed, worried about losing her home. He thought about all the late nights he had spent studying case law and legal procedures. He thought about his grandmother's words of encouragement and her faith in his abilities. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice now carrying a strength that surprised even himself. "I understand that my age and appearance may seem unusual in this setting, but the law doesn't discriminate based on age when it comes to emergency representation in housing cases. Section 47B clearly states, I don't want to hear about Section 47B. Judge Hawthorne snapped, slamming her gavel. "What I want is for you to sit down and be quiet before I hold you in contempt of court." The bailiff moved closer to Marcus, ready to physically remove him if necessary. Robert Westfield Jr. was now openly smirking, clearly enjoying the spectacle. He leaned back in his chair and whispered something to his assistant, who stifled a giggle, but Marcus didn't sit down. Instead, he opened his folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here a complete legal brief detailing Westfield Properties' violations of housing codes, improper eviction procedures, and evidence of a pattern of harassment designed to force out long-term tenants. Mrs. Henderson's case is not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic attempt to circumvent tenant protection laws." Judge Hawthorne stared at Marcus in disbelief. The laughter in the courtroom had died down to confused murmurs. Even Robert Westfield Jr. had stopped smirking and was now looking at Marcus with something approaching concern. "You prepared a legal brief?" the judge asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes, Your Honor. 47 pages with full citations of relevant case law, statutory references, and documented evidence of code violations. I've also prepared a motion to dismiss the eviction based on procedural irregularities and a counterclaim for harassment and illegal rent practices." The judge shook her head slowly. "This is absolutely unprecedented. I cannot believe we're even having this conversation. Bailiff, please escort this young man." "Your Honor," Marcus interrupted, his voice now carrying the confidence he had been building for 2 years. "I respectfully request that you review the brief before making your decision. If you find any legal errors or insufficient research, I will gladly leave this courtroom and accept whatever consequences you see fit. But if the law supports Mrs. Henderson's position, then justice demands that her case be heard, regardless of who presents it." For the first time since Marcus had entered the courtroom, Judge Hawthorne was speechless. She looked at the teenager standing before her bench, holding a stack of legal documents and speaking with the confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming, but something in Marcus's demeanor gave her pause. The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Hawthorne stared at Marcus for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring engine. Finally, she extended her hand toward Marcus. "Give me that brief," she said curtly. Marcus approached the bench carefully and handed over his carefully prepared document. Judge Hawthorne accepted it with obvious skepticism, expecting to find a few pages of internet research printed from a home computer. Instead, she found herself holding a professionally formatted legal document, complete with proper citations, case references, and legal arguments laid out in the exact format she would expect from any experienced attorney. She flipped through the pages quickly at first, then began reading more carefully. Her eyebrows raised as she encountered sophisticated legal reasoning and references to obscure housing law precedents. The courtroom remained silent as she continued reading, occasionally making small notes in the margins. Robert Westfield Jr. began to shift uncomfortably in his chair. He leaned forward and whispered urgently to his assistant, "Get me everything we have on the Henderson case now." Something about the judge's changing expression was making him nervous. After 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, Judge Hawthorne looked up from the brief. Her expression had completely changed. The amusement and condescension were gone, replaced by something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Surprise, respect, concern? "Mr. Thompson," she said, and Marcus was startled to realize she had somehow learned his name. "This is quite an impressive piece of legal work. Where exactly did you acquire this level of legal knowledge?" "I taught myself, Your Honor," Marcus replied honestly. "I've been studying law for 2 years using books from the library and online resources. I've also observed numerous court proceedings to understand proper procedures and presentation." Judge Hawthorne set the brief down and leaned forward. "You taught yourself law? From library books?" "Yes, Your Honor. I started with basic legal dictionaries and worked my way up to case law and statutory analysis. I've studied every major housing law case in this state from the past 20 years. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Several attorneys in attendance had stopped their side conversations and were now listening intently. Robert Westfield Jr. was frantically scribbling notes and looked considerably less confident than he had 30 minutes earlier. Judge Hawthorne turned to the prosecutor's table. "Mr. Westfield, have you reviewed the allegations made in this brief regarding your client's conduct?" Westfield stood up, adjusting his expensive tie. "Your Honor, with all due respect, regardless of how well written this document might be, it was prepared by someone with no legal training and no standing to appear before this court. I move that it be dismissed as inadmissible." Marcus stepped forward. "Your Honor, Mr. Westfield's motion ignores the fundamental issue of legal standing. Under Section 47B of the Housing Code, which was enacted specifically to protect tenants who cannot afford legal representation, emergency representation is explicitly permitted when 3 conditions are met." He held up 3 fingers as he spoke. "First, the tenant must be unable to appear due to circumstances beyond their control. Mrs. Henderson is hospitalized with a documented injury. Second, the tenant must provide written authorization for representation. I have that authorization, properly notarized. Third, the representative must demonstrate sufficient knowledge of applicable law to adequately represent the tenant's interests." Marcus gestured toward his brief. "Your Honor has just reviewed 47 pages of legal analysis that I believe demonstrate such knowledge." Judge Hawthorne looked back at the brief, then at Marcus, then at Robert Westfield Jr. "Mr. Westfield, are you familiar with Section 47B? Westfield's face had gone slightly pale. "Your Honor, That is, I would need to review the specific language of that statute." "I see," Judge Hawthorne said dryly. "So you're asking me to dismiss a legal argument based on a statute that you haven't actually reviewed, while the 17-year-old defendant has not only reviewed it, but can quote it from memory." The courtroom stirred with quiet conversations. Marcus could hear someone behind him whisper, "Did she just say 17? Another voice replied, "No way that kid is 17. Marcus seized the moment. "Your Honor, I understand that this situation is unusual, but the law was written to protect people like Mrs. Henderson, who face eviction through no fault of their own and cannot afford legal representation. The age of her representative shouldn't matter if the representation is competent." Judge Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Mr. Thompson, your brief alleges serious violations of housing codes by Westfield Properties. Specifically, you claim that they have systematically harassed long-term tenants to force them out before redevelopment. These are serious charges." "Yes, Your Honor. I have documented evidence of identical eviction proceedings against 7 other tenants in the same building over the past 6 months. In each case, Westfield Properties used identical language claiming lease violations that had never been enforced before." I also have photographs of housing code violations that have gone unrepaired for months, creating unsafe living conditions designed to encourage tenants to leave voluntarily. Robert Westfield Jr. stood up abruptly. Your Honor, I object to these unsubstantiated allegations. This child cannot possibly have conducted a proper investigation or gathered admissible evidence. Marcus calmly reached into his backpack and pulled out a second folder. Your Honor, I have sworn affidavits from 6 current and former tenants describing identical patterns of harassment. I also have photographs with date stamps showing housing code violations, along with copies of maintenance requests that were ignored by Westfield Properties for months. Judge Hawthorne accepted the folder and began reviewing its contents. As she read, her expression grew increasingly serious. The affidavits were properly formatted and notarized. The photographs clearly showed serious safety violations. The maintenance requests were documented with dates and signatures. Mr. Westfield, Judge Hawthorne said without looking up from the documents, are you familiar with these maintenance requests? Westfield was now visibly sweating. Your Honor, routine maintenance requests are handled by our property management staff. I couldn't possibly be familiar with every individual request. I see, the judge replied. So you're not familiar with requests to repair broken stair railings that could cause serious injuries? Or requests to fix heating systems in the middle of winter? Or requests to address electrical problems that could cause fires? Marcus watched as Westfield realized the gravity of the situation he was facing. These weren't just eviction proceedings anymore. They were potentially criminal violations of housing safety codes. Judge Hawthorne looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Thompson, you've presented compelling evidence of what could be systematic violations of housing law. However, I'm still concerned about allowing non-attorney representation, regardless of the quality of your work. Marcus took a deep breath. This was the moment he had prepared for more than any other. Your Honor, I understand your concerns about precedent and proper legal procedures, but I would ask you to consider this. If the law is truly about justice and not just procedure, then shouldn't Mrs. Henderson have the same right to competent representation as wealthy defendants who can afford expensive attorneys? The Housing Code's emergency representation provision exists precisely because the legislature recognized that justice delayed is justice denied. He paused and gestured toward Robert Westfield Jr. Mr. Westfield represents a company with significant resources and multiple attorneys. Mrs. Henderson is a single mother working 2 jobs to support her children. If you deny her representation today based purely on my age rather than the quality of my work, aren't you essentially saying that justice is only available to those who can afford it? Judge Hawthorne leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with intense curiosity. The courtroom remained completely silent as she processed everything she had witnessed in the past hour. Finally, she made a decision that would shock everyone present. Mr. Thompson, approach the bench, she said quietly. Marcus walked forward on unsteady legs. Judge Hawthorne leaned down so only he could hear her words. Son, in 25 years on this bench, I have never seen legal work of this quality from most practicing attorneys, let alone from a 17-year-old who taught himself law from library books. Where did you really learn to do this? Marcus looked up at her with complete honesty. Your Honor, everything I told you is true. But there's something else you should know. My parents died when I was 14. They were both killed by a drunk driver who had been arrested for DUI twice before, but kept getting his sentences reduced because he could afford expensive lawyers. My family couldn't even afford an attorney to fight for proper compensation. That's when I decided I was going to learn law myself, so I could help people who couldn't afford help. Judge Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry for your loss, Marcus, but that still doesn't explain how you developed such sophisticated legal skills. Marcus hesitated, then decided to reveal something he had kept secret for over a year. Your Honor, do you know Judge William Crawford from the State Appellate Court? Judge Hawthorne's eyes widened. Of course. He's one of the most respected jurists in the state. Why do you ask? He's been mentoring me for the past 14 months, though he asked me to keep it confidential. I met him at the library one day when he was researching a case. He saw me reading constitutional law and started asking me questions. When he realized how serious I was about learning law, he offered to guide my studies. The revelation hit Judge Hawthorne like a thunderbolt. Judge Crawford was legendary in legal circles. known for his brilliant legal mind and his reluctance to mentor anyone he didn't consider exceptional. If Crawford had been working with this teenager, it changed everything. "Judge Crawford has been teaching you?" she asked in amazement. "Not exactly teaching, Your Honor. More like guiding my self-study. He gives me reading lists, reviews my practice briefs, and lets me observe appellate court proceedings. He says I have an intuitive understanding of legal principles that he's rarely seen, even in law school graduates." Judge Hawthorne straightened up and addressed the courtroom. "I'm going to call a 30-minute recess. Everyone remain seated." She disappeared into her chambers and immediately called Judge Crawford's office. Within minutes, she had him on the phone. "Bill, it's Pat Hawthorne. I have a very unusual situation here. There's a 17-year-old in my courtroom who claims you've been mentoring him." "Marcus Thompson?" Judge Crawford's voice came through clearly. You've met Marcus. That boy is absolutely extraordinary, Pat. I've been working with him for over a year, and I can tell you without hesitation that he has a better grasp of legal fundamentals than most of my former law clerks." "Why? What's he up to?" "He's attempting to represent a tenant in an eviction case, and he's prepared legal briefs that are frankly better than what I see from many practicing attorneys." "But Bill, he's 17 years old. I can't just let a teenager practice law in my courtroom." Judge Crawford chuckled. "Pat, that boy knows housing law better than most specialists. I've been pushing him to apply to law school, but he insists on helping people in his community first. If he's prepared a proper brief and is following emergency representation protocols, I'd trust his work completely." Judge Hawthorne felt her worldview shifting. "Bill, are you seriously telling me to let a teenager argue a case in my courtroom?" "Pat, I'm telling you that Marcus Thompson is one of the most naturally gifted legal minds I've encountered in 40 years of practice. His age is irrelevant. His knowledge and preparation are what matter." After hanging up, Judge Hawthorne sat in her chambers for several minutes trying to process what she had learned. When she returned to the courtroom, her entire demeanor had changed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this court will now address the Henderson versus Westfield Properties case. Mr. Thompson, you may proceed with your representation of Mrs. Henderson." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Robert Westfield Jr. shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I must object. This is highly irregular." Judge Hawthorne fixed him with a stern look. "Mr. Westfield, I have reviewed the applicable law and determined that Mr. Thompson meets all requirements for emergency representation under Section 47B. Unless you can cite specific legal grounds for your objection, I suggest you prepare to respond to his arguments on their merits rather than challenging his standing." Marcus felt a surge of confidence as he realized the judge was actually going to let him present Sarah Henderson's case. But he also felt the enormous weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about proving his own abilities anymore. It was about getting justice for Sarah, and potentially for all the other tenants being harassed by Westfield Properties. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice now steady and professional. "Mrs. Henderson has been a tenant at 247 Maple Street for 6 years. During that time, she has never been late with rent, never violated her lease terms, and has been a model tenant. The eviction notice she received cites excessive overnight guests as grounds for termination, but this allegation is both false and pretextual." He opened his folder and pulled out a timeline he had prepared. The alleged violation occurred on dates when Mrs. Henderson was actually working night shifts at her second job. I have her employment records and signed statements from co-workers confirming her whereabouts on those dates. Robert Westfield Jr. looked increasingly uncomfortable as Marcus continued, presenting evidence with the precision of an experienced litigator. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the lease provision being cited has never been enforced against any tenant in the building during the 6 years Mrs. Henderson has lived there. The sudden enforcement coincides exactly with Westfield Properties' acquisition of demolition permits for the building." Marcus pulled out another document. "I have here a copy of the demolition permit application, filed just 2 weeks before the first eviction notice was served. The permit specifically states that the building must be vacant before demolition can begin." Judge Hawthorne examined the permit application with growing interest. "Mr. Westfield, are you familiar with this document?" Westfield was now clearly flustered. "Your Honor, my client's redevelopment plans don't negate their right to enforce lease violations." Marcus seized on this admission. "Your Honor, Mr. Westfield just acknowledged that this eviction is related to redevelopment plans. Under state tenant protection laws, landlords must provide 6 months' notice and relocation assistance for tenants displaced by redevelopment, not manufacture fake lease violations to avoid their legal obligations. The courtroom was now buzzing with excitement. Several attorneys were taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A teenager was not only holding his own against an experienced lawyer, but was systematically dismantling the opposing case with surgical precision. Judge Hawthorne looked at Marcus with undisguised admiration. "Mr. Thompson, do you have additional evidence to support these allegations?" Marcus smiled confidently. "Yes, Your Honor, much more." Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out a third folder, this one significantly thicker than the others. The methodical way he organized his materials impressed everyone in the courtroom, including the court reporter who had stopped typing to watch the proceedings unfold. "Your Honor, what I'm about to present demonstrates a pattern of systematic harassment that goes far beyond Mrs. Henderson's case," Marcus announced, his confidence growing with each word. "Westfield Properties has been deliberately violating housing codes and tenant rights as part of a coordinated effort to force out long-term tenants." He opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. These images show dangerous conditions in the building that have existed for months despite repeated maintenance requests. Broken stair railings, exposed electrical wiring, non-functioning heat in winter, and plumbing leaks that have caused mold growth. Judge Hawthorne accepted the photographs and examined them carefully. Each image was properly labeled with dates, times, and specific locations within the building. The quality of documentation rivaled what she typically saw from professional investigators. "Mr. Thompson, how did you obtain these photographs?" "I live in the same building, Your Honor. Mrs. Henderson is my neighbor. I've witnessed these conditions firsthand and documented them systematically over the past 8 months. Robert Westfield Jr. attempted to object. "Your Honor, these photographs could have been staged or taken out of context." Marcus was ready for this challenge. "Your Honor, I have corresponding maintenance requests for each violation shown in these photographs. The requests are dated, signed by tenants, and include the property management company's written responses." He handed Judge Hawthorne a stack of maintenance request forms. "As you can see, Westfield Properties consistently responded that repairs would be made as soon as possible, or when scheduling permits. But none of these safety violations were actually addressed." Judge Hawthorne reviewed the maintenance requests with increasing alarm. Some of the safety violations were serious enough to warrant immediate emergency repairs. Yet they had been ignored for months. "Mr. Westfield," Judge Hawthorne addressed the opposing counsel directly, "are you prepared to explain why your client ignored repeated requests to repair dangerous conditions in their property?" Westfield was now visibly sweating. "Your Honor, property maintenance is handled by our management staff. I would need to consult with them to provide specific responses to these allegations," Marcus interjected smoothly. "Your Honor, I can save Mr. Westfield the trouble of consulting with his management staff. I have sworn affidavits from 3 former employees of Westfield Properties who were instructed to delay repairs in the Maple Street building specifically to encourage tenant turnover." The courtroom gasped audibly. This was no longer a simple eviction case. It had become an expose of systematic tenant harassment. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward intensely. "Mr. Thompson, you're alleging that Westfield Properties deliberately neglected repairs to force tenants to move?" "Yes, Your Honor, and I have documented proof." Marcus pulled out 3 notarized affidavits. These statements are from Maria Santos, former maintenance supervisor, James Wright, former property manager, and David Chen, former administrative assistant. All 3 worked for Westfield Properties during the relevant time period, and all 3 confirmed that they received explicit instructions to delay repairs at 247 Maple Street. He handed the affidavits to Judge Hawthorne, who read them with increasing concern. As she reviewed each statement, her expression grew more serious. The affidavits detailed specific conversations where employees were told to make life difficult for long-term tenants and to find reasons to delay any repairs that might make tenants comfortable. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, "Maria Santos's affidavit specifically mentions a meeting where management discussed the Maple Street redevelopment project. According to her statement, she was told that the company wanted all tenants out within 6 months but couldn't afford to pay proper relocation costs. So they needed to find creative ways to encourage voluntary departures. Robert Westfield Jr. was now frantically whispering with his assistant, clearly unprepared for the depth of evidence Marcus had assembled. He stood up desperately. "Your Honor, these are disgruntled former employees making unsubstantiated claims. There's no proof these alleged conversations ever took place." Marcus smiled slightly. "Actually, Mr. Westfield, there is proof. David Chen, the former administrative assistant, kept detailed notes of meetings in his personal notebook. With his permission, I had his relevant notes reviewed by a handwriting expert and notarized. He produced a leather notebook along with a notarized statement from a certified handwriting analyst. The expert confirms that these notes were written contemporaneously during the meetings in question, not created after the fact." Judge Hawthorne examined the notebook entries, which detailed specific strategies for pressuring tenants to leave, including deliberately delaying repairs, citing minor lease violations that had previously been ignored, and scheduling construction work during inconvenient hours. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Hawthorne said, clearly impressed, "this level of investigation is remarkable. How did you manage to locate these former employees and convince them to provide statements? Your Honor, when people see injustice happening, many of them want to help stop it. I spent weeks tracking down former employees through social media and mutual acquaintances. When I explained what was happening to families like Mrs. Henderson's, most of them were eager to tell the truth about what they had witnessed." Marcus pulled out yet another document. "I also have financial records showing that Westfield Properties has used identical tactics at 3 other buildings in the past 2 years. In each case, they acquired demolition permits shortly before beginning systematic eviction proceedings against long-term tenants." Judge Hawthorne accepted the financial documents, which showed a clear pattern of property acquisitions, followed immediately by tenant harassment campaigns. The evidence painted a picture of a company that had turned tenant displacement into a profitable business model. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had thoroughly mastered his subject, "what we're seeing here isn't just a landlord-tenant dispute. It's a systematic violation of housing laws designed to protect vulnerable families from displacement. Mrs. Henderson isn't just fighting for her own home. She's fighting for the rights of every tenant who faces similar harassment." Robert Westfield Jr. made one final attempt to regain control of the case. "Your Honor, even if these allegations were true, which my client denies, Mrs. Henderson still violated her lease by having unauthorized overnight guests." Marcus was ready for this argument. "Your Honor, I'd like to address that specific allegation. The lease violation notice claims that Mrs. Henderson had unauthorized guests on 3 specific dates in March. However, I have Mrs. Henderson's work schedule showing she was working night shifts at Memorial Hospital on all 3 dates. Additionally, I have security footage from the hospital parking garage, showing her car present during the entire period. She was allegedly entertaining guests at home." He handed over the work schedule and a CD containing the security footage. "I also have signed statements from her supervisors and co-workers confirming her presence at work during those shifts." Judge Hawthorne shook her head in amazement. "Mr. Thompson, you've essentially conducted a complete legal investigation. How long did this take you?" "About 6 weeks of intensive work, Your Honor. But I had help from other tenants in the building who were facing similar harassment. When people work together, they can accomplish a lot more than when they work alone." Marcus gestured toward the gallery, where several other tenants from the building were now sitting, having arrived during the proceedings. "Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson's case represents just one example of what Westfield Properties has been doing to dozens of families. If you rule in her favor today, you'll be protecting not just her rights, but the rights of every tenant who faces similar tactics." Judge Hawthorne looked at Robert Westfield Jr., who appeared to have run out of arguments. His expensive suit was wrinkled from stress and his confident demeanor had completely evaporated. "Mr. Westfield, do you have any response to the evidence presented by Mr. Thompson?" Westfield stood up slowly, looking defeated. "Your Honor, my client will need time to review these allegations and prepare a proper response." Judge Hawthorne nodded grimly. "I'm sure they will. In the meantime, I'm prepared to rule on Mrs. Henderson's eviction case." The courtroom fell completely silent as everyone waited for the judge's decision. Marcus felt his heart pounding as he realized that everything he had worked for over the past 2 years was about to be put to the ultimate test. Judge Hawthorne set down the last of Marcus's evidence and looked out over the packed courtroom. Word had somehow spread through the courthouse about the extraordinary proceedings taking place, and attorneys, court staff, and observers had quietly filled every available seat. The silence was so complete that the soft hum of the recording equipment seemed amplified. "In my 25 years on this bench," Judge Hawthorne began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "I have never witnessed a more thorough, professional, or compelling presentation of evidence. Mr. Thompson, your work today has been nothing short of extraordinary." Marcus felt his knees wobble slightly, but he remained standing at attention, waiting for the judge's ruling on Sarah Henderson's case. "However," Judge Hawthorne continued, "this case has revealed issues that extend far beyond a simple landlord-tenant dispute. The evidence presented suggests systematic violations of housing law, tenant harassment, and potentially criminal negligence regarding safety code violations." She turned to address Robert Westfield Jr. directly. "Mr. Westfield, based on the evidence presented today, I am not only dismissing the eviction proceedings against Mrs. Henderson, but I am also ordering your client to immediately address all safety violations documented in Mr. Thompson's evidence. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal violations of housing law." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Several of the tenants in the gallery began crying with relief. Marcus felt a surge of emotion but maintained his professional composure. Judge Hawthorne wasn't finished. "Additionally, Westfield Properties is hereby ordered to pay Mrs. Henderson's legal fees and damages for the harassment she has endured. While Mr. Thompson is not a licensed attorney and therefore cannot collect attorney's fees, Mrs. Henderson is entitled to compensation for the violation of her tenant rights." Robert Westfield Jr. stood up shakily. "Your Honor, my client intends to appeal this ruling." "That is certainly your right, Mr. Westfield. However, I should inform you that I am also issuing a temporary restraining order preventing Westfield Properties from initiating any new eviction proceedings at 247 Maple Street, pending the Attorney General's investigation." Judge Hawthorne then turned her attention back to Marcus. Mr. Thompson approached the bench. Marcus walked forward on unsteady legs, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. He had not only won Sarah Henderson's case, but had potentially saved the homes of dozens of other families. "Son," Judge Hawthorne said quietly, "what you've accomplished today goes far beyond legal representation. You've exposed a systematic pattern of abuse that could have affected hundreds of families. But I need to ask you something important. What are your plans for the future?" Marcus looked up at her with genuine uncertainty. "Your Honor, I want to keep helping people who can't afford legal representation. There are so many families in my neighborhood facing similar problems." Judge Hawthorne smiled for the first time since the proceedings began. "Marcus, you have a gift that shouldn't be wasted. Have you considered applying to law school?" "I've thought about it, Your Honor, but law school is expensive and I need to help support my grandmother. Plus, I'm not even sure I could get accepted without a college degree." Judge Hawthorne leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Thompson, after what I've witnessed today, I can guarantee you that any law school in the country would be honored to have you as a student. And as for the financial concerns, I suspect there are people who would be very interested in supporting your education." She gestured toward the gallery, where Marcus noticed several well-dressed individuals he didn't recognize taking notes and speaking quietly among themselves. "Those gentlemen represent the State Bar Association's Scholarship Committee. They heard about these proceedings and came to observe. I suspect you'll be hearing from them very soon." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. Just a few hours ago, he had been a teenager from the projects trying to help his neighbor. Now he was being told that law schools and scholarship committees were interested in his future. Judge Hawthorne addressed the courtroom one final time. "This case has reminded all of us that justice isn't about age, credentials, or expensive suits. It's about dedication, preparation, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Mr. Thompson has demonstrated all of these qualities in abundance." She banged her gavel. "Court is adjourned." As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus was immediately surrounded by people wanting to congratulate him, ask him questions, or offer him opportunities. The representatives from the Bar Association introduced themselves and explained that they had several full scholarships available for exceptional candidates. 2 law school deans had somehow heard about the proceedings and wanted to discuss admission possibilities. But Marcus's attention was focused on his phone, which was buzzing with a text message from the hospital. Sarah Henderson had been released and was on her way to the courthouse. 20 minutes later, Sarah arrived in a wheelchair, her legs still in a cast but her face beaming with joy. When she saw Marcus, she began crying tears of relief and gratitude. "Marcus, they told me what you did. I can't believe you saved my home. How can I ever thank you?" Marcus knelt down beside her wheelchair. "Mrs. Henderson, you don't need to thank me. This is what neighbors do for each other." As the crowd around them continued to buzz with excitement and opportunity, Marcus thought about his parents and how proud they would have been. He thought about his grandmother Rosa, who had supported his unusual studying habits even when she didn't understand them. He thought about all the other families in his neighborhood who were facing similar struggles. Judge Hawthorne approached them as the courtroom finally began to clear. "Mrs. Henderson, you're very fortunate to have a neighbor like Marcus. And Marcus, you should know that what happened here today will have implications far beyond this single case. The Attorney General's investigation will likely result in protections for hundreds of other tenants across the state." She handed Marcus her business card. "I want you to stay in touch. The legal profession needs people like you, people who understand that law should serve justice, not just those who can afford it." As they left the courthouse together, Marcus realized that his life had changed completely in the span of a single morning. The teenager who had walked into the courthouse expecting to be laughed out had emerged as someone being courted by law schools and celebrated by the legal community. But more importantly, Sarah Henderson was going home to her children instead of to a homeless shelter, and dozens of other families would sleep safely in their homes tonight because someone had finally stood up to a powerful corporation that had been taking advantage of them. Walking out into the afternoon sunlight, Marcus smiled as he thought about what his grandmother would say when he told her about his day. Rosa had always believed that education and determination could overcome any obstacle. Today, she had been proven absolutely right. The boy who had taught himself law from library books had just shown an entire courtroom that justice doesn't require a law degree. It requires courage, preparation, and the willingness to fight for what's right. And Marcus Thompson had all three in abundance.